That ugly thing is a blight on this community, and you have exactly 7 days to remove it, or the fines will start at $500 a day, Mr. Garrison. We have standards here. The voice belonged to Karen Vance, the self-appointed queen of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, and her pronouncement was delivered with the absolute certainty of a monarch addressing a particularly grimy peasant. She stood on my freshly cut lawn, her considerable frame wrapped in a garish floral pantsuit that seemed to be at war with nature itself. Her arms were crossed, a gesture that managed to be both defensive and aggressive, and her eyes, narrowed into judgmental slits, were fixed not on me, but on the small, unassuming satellite dish mounted discreetly on the side of my roof, partially obscured by a mature pin oak. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was a declaration of war. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it left me momentarily speechless. The ugly thing she was referring to wasn't some rust bucket eyesore. It was a modern, professional-grade VSAT dish, the kind you see on commercial buildings. And it was the only reason I had a stable internet connection capable of supporting my work-from-home consulting business out here in the ex-urban fringe where cable monopolies feared to tread. But more than that, and this was the part that made a slow, cold anger begin to coalesce in my gut, it was the only reason she had a stable internet connection at her little kingdom's gatehouse. The irony was so thick you could have paved a driveway with it. I could feel the heat of the Texas sun on my neck, the humid air thick and still, but a different kind of heat was rising inside me, a familiar, disciplined anger I hadn't felt since my last tour. This woman, who likely considered navigating a crowded supermarket parking lot a strategic challenge, had just threatened my livelihood and my home with the casual arrogance of someone who had never been truly challenged in her life. She had picked the wrong fight with the wrong soldier on the wrong day. If you've ever had a run-in with a power-tripping HOA board member who thinks they own the air you breathe, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because you're going to want to see how this ends. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from, or better yet, share your own HOA nightmare story. I want to hear them all. Now back to how I found myself in the crosshairs of a suburban tyrant. My wife, Sarah, and I had moved to Oak Ridge Estates 6 months prior, seeking a slice of peace after my 20 years in the Army's Signal Corps. We'd bought a beautiful 5-acre lot on the edge of the development, a little peninsula of land that offered privacy and a view of the wooded greenbelt. It was our forever home, the place where I was supposed to trade my combat boots for gardening gloves and my encrypted communications for casual chats with neighbors. The one major drawback, which the realtor had conveniently glossed over, was the abysmal internet service. The local provider offered a DSL line that was slower than a glacier and less reliable than a politician's promise. For a guy who made his living doing remote network security analysis for corporate clients, that was a non-starter. So I did what I always do. I identified the problem, researched the solution, and executed. I invested a few $1,000s in a commercial-grade satellite internet system. It wasn't your standard consumer dish. This was a high-throughput, low-latency setup that gave me a rock-solid 100 megabits per second connection, more than enough for my encrypted data transfers and Sarah's incessant streaming of British baking shows. When I installed it, I followed the HOA covenants to the letter, or so I thought. The rules mentioned satellite dishes, but they were written in the 1990s, clearly referring to the giant 10-foot C-band dishes of that era. My dish was less than a meter in diameter and tucked away on a side of the house barely visible from the street. I submitted the architectural request form, waited the requisite 30 days, and having received no response, which under the bylaws constituted tacit approval, I proceeded with the installation. For 5 months, there was silence. Peace. Then a new guard shack was built at the community entrance, complete with automated gates, security cameras, and a computer for the guards to log visitors. The problem? The main office had forgotten to run a data line out to it. The quotes to trench a fiber optic cable half a mile from the clubhouse were astronomical. The board was in a panic. During a casual conversation at the community mailbox, one of the board members, a retired accountant named George who was generally reasonable, mentioned the dilemma. I saw a simple solution. "George," I'd said, I have a commercial-grade satellite link at my place. I can set up a point-to-point wireless bridge from my dish to the guard shack. It's secure, reliable, and I'll do it for free, just as a neighborly gesture. George was ecstatic. The board, led by Karen, eagerly accepted. I spent a weekend mounting a small receiver on the guard shack, configured the network, and just like that, their five-figure problem was solved for the cost of a few $100s in equipment that I provided. They had their gate cameras, their visitor logs, their precious veneer of security, all running silently and efficiently through my ugly thing. And for a month, all was well. Until Karen got reelected as HOA president, apparently unopposed, and decided to celebrate her renewed reign with a campaign of petty tyranny. My dish, it seemed, was her first target. The formal notice arrived 3 days after Karen's lawnside ambush, delivered by certified mail, as if it were a legal summons for a capital crime. The envelope was thick, embossed with the Oak Ridge Estates logo, and the paper inside was a heavy, creamy cardstock designed to convey an authority the contents couldn't earn on their own. The letter was a masterpiece of bureaucratic passive aggression, citing a vaguely worded clause from the covenants about exterior attachments not in harmony with the community's aesthetic standards. My dish, it declared, was in violation. The initial $500 fine was detailed, along with a schedule of escalating daily penalties that would quickly reach a ruinous level. It mentioned the possibility of a lien against my property if the fines went unpaid. It was signed in a florid, self-important script. Karen Vance, President, Oak Ridge HOA Board of Directors. There was no mention of our informal agreement regarding the guard shack, no acknowledgement of the service I was providing. It was as if that entire arrangement existed in a separate universe, one where Karen wasn't a hypocrite benefiting directly from the very thing she was trying to eliminate. I placed the letter on the granite countertop in our kitchen, the slick paper a stark white against the dark stone. Sarah read it over my shoulder, her hand coming to rest on my arm. "Jack, this is insane," she whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. $500 a day. Can she do that? I took a slow, deliberate breath, the kind of tactical breathing we practice to stay calm under fire. Anger was a hot, useless emotion. Cold, focused resolve was a weapon. "She thinks she can," I said, my voice low and even. "That is what we need to find out." That evening, I didn't get angry. I got organized. I retrieved the thick binder of HOA documents we'd been given at closing and spread them across the dining room table. The covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and Rs, the bylaws, the rules, and regulations, a forest of paper designed to intimidate and confuse. I spent the next 4 hours with a highlighter and a legal pad, cross-referencing clauses, reading footnotes, and dissecting the legalese. I was no lawyer, but 20 years in the Signal Corps teaches you how to read technical manuals and complex regulations with an eye for loopholes and inconsistencies. The clause she cited was indeed vague, a classic catch-all that gave the board subjective power. But I also found the section on approvals. It stated that if the Architectural Review Committee, a committee of one, Karen, failed to respond to a request within 30 days, it was deemed approved. I had my email and the submission confirmation from their clunky online portal. Checkmate number 1. Then I found the section on fining authority. It required a formal hearing process, including the right for the home owner to present their case before the full board. Her letter, with its immediate threat of fines, had skipped that crucial step. Checkmate number 2. The next day I began my counteroffensive. It started not with a bang, but with a click. I composed a polite, professionally worded email to the entire HOA board, not just Karen. I attached a copy of her violation letter, my original architectural submission with its timestamp, and a screenshot of the deemed approved clause from the bylaws. I respectfully pointed out the procedural error regarding the lack of a hearing. I detailed the history of the guard shack internet, carefully framing it as a community support project I had undertaken at the board's request. I included the model numbers of the equipment and a link to the manufacturer's website to show it was modern, professional gear, not some scrapyard relic. My closing was simple. I trust this is a simple misunderstanding that can be quickly rectified. I look forward to your written confirmation that the violation notice has been rescinded. I hit send. The digital volley was fired. Then I went for a walk. I needed to see the battlefield. I strolled through the neighborhood, my eyes now open to the aesthetic standards Karen was so keen to enforce. I saw a house with peeling paint, another with a political flag that had been flying for months in violation of the 30-day rule. I saw a garish pink flamingo display on one lawn and a rusty, non-operational vintage car parked in a driveway on another. I took discreet photos with my phone, timestamping each one. The hypocrisy was blatant. Karen wasn't enforcing standards. She was selectively targeting. The question was, why me? Was it the newness of my arrival? Or was it something more? As I rounded the corner back toward my street, I saw Karen's car, a boat-sized white SUV, parked in front of the Miller's house. Mr. and Mrs. Miller were a sweet retired couple in their late 70s. As I watched, Karen emerged from the house, her face a mask of smug satisfaction. Mrs. Miller stood in the doorway, her shoulders slumped, looking utterly defeated. Karen got in her car and drove off without a backward glance. I quickened my pace. Something was wrong. I had found Mrs. Miller still in the doorway, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. "Are you all right, Eleanor?" I asked gently. She looked up startled. "Oh, Jack, it's Karen. She's making us remove our rose bushes. Says they're attracting too many bees." Rose bushes. She was fining an elderly woman for her prize-winning rose bushes. The cold resolve in my gut hardened into something sharper, something that felt a lot like a mission. This wasn't just about my satellite dish anymore. This was about a bully who had terrorized a community for too long, and her reign was about to come to an end. The board's response to my email was telling. George, the accountant, replied within an hour, a short, apologetic note saying he'd bring it up at the next meeting and that he hadn't been aware of the letter Karen had sent. Two other members sent similar "we'll look into it" replies. From Karen, there was only a thunderous, echoing silence. It was a classic power play. Ignore the challenge and hope it goes away, assuming the challenge lacks the stamina for a sustained fight. She underestimated me. My investigation deepened, transitioning from a defense of my own property to a full-blown intelligence-gathering operation against a hostile regime. My dining room table now resembled a command center. I had the HOA documents, my photographs of other violations, and a growing stack of notes. I started with the HOA's public-facing website, which was a poorly designed relic from the early 2000s. But it had one treasure, an archive of meeting minutes going back 5 years. I downloaded every single file. The reading was as dry as dust, page after page of motions to approve landscaping contracts and debates over the color of the clubhouse trim. But patterns began to emerge. Karen's name was on everything. She was the sole member of the Architectural Review Committee, giving her unilateral power over any homeowner's modification. She was the chair of the fining committee. She was the signatory on all the major contracts. The other board members seemed to be little more than rubber stamps. I cross-referenced the dates of the minutes with the dates of violation notices I was beginning to hear about from neighbors. A pattern of selective enforcement became crystal clear. A family who had hosted a large graduation party was hit with a parking violation notice the next week. A homeowner who had publicly disagreed with Karen at a meeting was suddenly cited for the color of his mailbox. It was retaliation, pure and simple, masked by the thin veneer of rules. The next phase of my operation was human intelligence. I started taking my morning coffee on my front porch instead of the back deck. I made a point of waving to everyone who drove by. I started a conversation with the mailman, a friendly guy named Mike who had been on this route for a decade. "Yeah, that Karen," he said, shaking his head as he sorted my mail. "She's a piece of work. Tries to tell me how to park my truck, the federal mail truck." He told me about the constant turnover of landscaping companies. "They all quit," Mike said. "She follows their guys around, micromanaging them, complaining about every blade of grass. Most of them say it's not worth the headache." This led me to my next line of inquiry, the financials. As a homeowner, I was entitled to review the HOA's financial records. I drafted a formal registered letter, again, creating an official paper trail, requesting copies of all financial statements, budgets, and detailed spending reports for the last 3 years. I specifically asked for all invoices from the landscaping companies and the legal firm the HOA kept on retainer. I knew this request would set off alarm bells, but under the state's property code, they had to comply. While I waited for that bombshell to land, I paid another visit to the Millers. I brought a container of Sarah's famous lemon bars. This time, I sat with both of them in their living room. At first, they were hesitant, afraid of retribution. "She can make things so difficult," Mr. Miller said, his hands trembling slightly. But as I calmly explained what I had found in the bylaws, about their rights, about the pattern of harassment, they began to open up. The rose bushes were just the latest offense. A year ago, it was a citation for their bird bath, which allegedly created a mosquito hazard. Before that, it was the unapproved shade of white on their window trim, which had been the same color for 20 years. They had paid over $2,000 in petty fines over the last 3 years, too scared and exhausted to fight. As I left their house, my anger was tempered by a grim determination. I wasn't just fighting for a satellite dish. I was fighting for the Miller's rose bushes. I was fighting for the family who just wanted their kids to have a basketball hoop. I was fighting for every person who had been cowed into submission by this petty tyrant. My most crucial discovery, however, came from an unexpected source. George, the board's treasurer, called me one evening. His voice was hushed, nervous. "Jack, I got your records request," he said. "Karen is furious. She's trying to get the lawyer to block it." "She can't block it, George," I said calmly. "It's my legal right." There was a long pause. "I know," he finally said. "Listen, I can't officially help you. She'd have my hide. But maybe you should take a very close look at the invoices for community maintenance and repair, especially the ones from a company called Vance Services." Vance, Karen's last name. "Vance Services?" I repeated, my pen already scratching on a notepad. "What do they do?" "That's the thing," George whispered, and I could hear the fear and frustration in his voice. "I don't know. The invoices are always vague. General repairs, grounds upkeep, and they're always just under the amount that requires a full board vote for approval. Karen just signs off on them herself." The puzzle pieces were no longer just fitting together. They were locking into place with a sickening, satisfying click. This wasn't just about power. It was about money. Karen wasn't just a bully. She was almost certainly a grifter, using the HOA's coffers as her personal piggy bank. My satellite dish had been the catalyst, the random act of defiance that had caused her to overplay her hand. Now, armed with George's tip, I knew exactly where to aim my next shot. The simple battle over a piece of technology was about to become a full-scale forensic audit. The official response to my financial records request was a masterclass in stonewalling, drafted by the HOA's attorney. It was a condescending letter that claimed my request was overly broad and burdensome, and accused me of engaging in a fishing expedition. It offered to allow me to view the records in person at the lawyer's office, by appointment only, for a fee of $150 per hour to have a paralegal supervise me. They were building a wall of money and inconvenience, assuming I would back down. This was a critical miscalculation. They were treating me like a disgruntled homeowner. I was operating like a counterintelligence officer. I immediately sent a reply, again via registered mail, to create an undeniable record of receipt. I cited the specific state statute that mandated they provide copies at a reasonable cost, defining reasonable as the actual cost of photocopying. I included a blank check for $50, noting it should be more than sufficient to cover the cost of copying the requested documents, and stated that their failure to comply within the statutory 10-day window would result in a formal complaint being filed with the State Attorney General's office. This was no longer a polite request. It was a legal demand with a clear threat of escalation to a higher authority. While the lawyers shuffled their papers, I launched the next phase of my plan, the paperwork war. I had identified dozens of procedural requirements in the bylaws that Karen's board routinely ignored. Now I would use those same procedures to tie them in knots. I filed a formal request for the meeting minutes of the Architectural Review Committee for the past 2 years. Since Karen was the only member, I knew no such meetings had occurred and no minutes existed. I filed a request for the complete voting record of every board member on every motion for the last 12 months, something the bylaws required them to maintain, but which I was certain they didn't. I submitted a formal inquiry asking for clarification on the aesthetic harmony clause, requesting a detailed, written rubric defining the exact criteria used to approve or deny applications, thereby challenging the subjective nature of Karen's power. Each request was polite, cited a specific clause in the governing documents, and was sent via certified mail. I was creating a blizzard of legitimate, process-driven demands that they were legally obligated to answer. The goal was twofold. First, to force them to expend time, energy, and the HOA's money on legal fees to respond. Second, and more importantly, to create an official record of their noncompliance and incompetence. Karen's reaction was exactly what I'd predicted. I received a furious phone call 2 days after my third request went out. "What do you think you're doing, Mr. Garrison?" she shrieked, her voice stripped of its fake neighborhood sweetness. "I am a homeowner exercising my rights as outlined in the CC&Rs, I replied, my voice deliberately calm and monotone. I had my phone on speaker, and a digital recorder was running. "You are harassing me. You are harassing the board." "I am requesting documents I am legally entitled to," I stated. "If you believe my requests are illegitimate, please have your attorney state as much in writing, citing the specific legal basis for denial." There was a sputtering on the other end of the line. She was used to people cowering, not quoting statutes back at her. "You and your ugly satellite dish are the problem. You just can't stand being told no." "My original application was deemed approved per your own bylaws, Karen," I said, using her first name for the first time. "The dish is not the issue here. The issue is a lack of transparency and what appears to be a pattern of procedural and financial irregularities. For example, could you tell me about Vance Services?" The silence on the line was profound. It was the sound of a predator realizing it has just walked into a snare. I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head as she tried to process how I could possibly know that name. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she finally stammered, her voice suddenly defensive and shaky. "I have the invoices, Karen," I lied, a calculated bluff. "The ones for general repairs, always just under the $2,500 threshold for a full board vote. The ones you alone approve." I let that hang in the air. The bluff worked. She didn't deny it. Instead, she defaulted to rage. "This is slander. You'll be hearing from our lawyer." The line went dead. I smiled. A direct hit. She had confirmed everything with her panicked reaction. A few days later, a thick manila envelope arrived not from the HOA's lawyer, but directly from the management company. Inside were photocopies of the financial records I had requested. My legal threat had worked. They knew they were on shaky ground and had been forced to comply. That night, with Sarah reading over my shoulder, I spread the documents across the table. It was better and worse than I had imagined. There they were, dozens of invoices from Vance Services, over 3 years totaling over $40,000. The address listed for the company was a P.O. box in a neighboring town. The services were always described with comical vagueness: common area maintenance, gate mechanism repair, clubhouse power washing. And the amounts were always just under the wire: $2,450, $2,490, $2,475. A quick search of the state's business registry told me everything I needed to know. Vance Services was a sole proprietorship registered 2 years ago. The owner? Harold Vance, Karen's husband. She wasn't just a bully, she was an embezzler, funneling tens of thousands of dollars of her neighbors' money into her own family's pockets through a shell company for work that was likely never even done. The satellite dish was a sideshow. This was the main event. My personal fight had just uncovered a potential felony. The stakes had been raised exponentially, and Karen, in her blind arrogance, had handed me the ammunition to burn her kingdom to the ground. The discovery of the Vance Services invoices changed the entire dynamic of the conflict. This was no longer a simple dispute between a homeowner and an overzealous HOA president. It was now a matter of uncovering and exposing corruption that affected every single person in the community. My strategy shifted from defense to a full-scale campaign to liberate Oak Ridge Estates. But I knew I couldn't do it alone. A lone wolf, no matter how justified, could be painted as a disgruntled crank. I needed allies. I needed to build a consensus. I needed to transform my private war into a public cause. My first stop was back at the Miller's house. This time I didn't bring baked goods. I brought a folder containing copies of the Vance Services invoices and the business registration showing Harold Vance as the owner. I sat with them at their kitchen table, the scent of Mr. Miller's roses wafting in through the open window, and I laid out the evidence piece by piece. I explained the pattern of payments, the vague descriptions, the suspicious amounts just under the board approval threshold. Eleanor Miller's hand went to her mouth, her eyes wide. Arthur Miller, who had seemed so frail before, straightened in his chair, a spark of old fire in his eyes. "That woman," he said, his voice a low growl, "that woman fined us $100 because our welcome mat was excessively worn. And all this time she's been stealing from us." The sense of personal betrayal was palpable. It was their money, their dues that had been funneled into Karen's pockets. "She's not just a bully, she's a thief," I said quietly. "And I don't think you're the only ones who have been targeted. I think she uses the fines and harassment to silence people, to keep them too scared to look too closely at what she's doing." I proposed an idea, a small secret meeting at my house for a few of the neighbors I suspected had also been on the receiving end of Karen's tyranny. The Millers agreed immediately. Arthur, a retired union organizer, seemed to relish the idea of a clandestine meeting. "We'll be there," he said, his voice firm. "Just tell us when." Over the next 2 days, I discreetly approached 3 other families. There was the Rodriguez family, who had been fined for their son's portable basketball hoop, which they dutifully stored in their garage every night. There was a young doctor, Emily Chen, who had received a nasty letter about her designated parking spot at the townhouses being perpetually occupied, even though it was her own assigned spot. And there was Mark, a contractor who had a work truck he parked on the street during the day while loading materials, for which he'd been threatened with towing despite it being a public road. I spoke to each of them individually, not in a group. I didn't lead with the financial fraud. I started with their story. I listened. I empathized. I showed them they weren't alone by sharing the Miller's story about the rose bushes. Only when I had established a foundation of shared grievance did I mention that I had found something more, something that explained Karen's behavior. I invited them to my home for a neighborhood watch discussion on a Tuesday evening. That Tuesday, my dining room, which had served as my war room, became a council chamber. The 7 of us, Sarah and I, the Millers, the Rodriguezes, and Dr. Chen, Mark was working late but had given me his proxy, gathered around the table. The atmosphere was tense, a mix of fear and angry curiosity. I started the meeting by thanking them for coming, acknowledging the risk they felt they were taking. Then I laid it all out. I started with my own story about the satellite dish in the guard shack. I moved on to the pattern of selective enforcement, using my photos of unenforced violations to prove the point. Then I unveiled the centerpiece, the financial documents. I passed around the copies of the Vance Services invoices. I showed them the state registration for the company. As the realization dawned on each person's face, the fear in the room was replaced by a slow-burning, collective anger. It was one thing to be bullied over a basketball hoop. It was another thing entirely to be stolen from. $40,000? Mister, Rodriguez said, his voice incredulous. "We had to fight with her for 3 months to get the board to approve a $50 repair to the playground swing set. And our dues went up 7% last year," Dr. Chen added, her analytical mind clearly processing the implications. She claimed it was because of rising insurance costs. The dam of fear had broken. For the next hour, the stories poured out. It was a flood of petty tyrannies, of abuses of power big and small, the fines, the threats, the public humiliations at HOA meetings. Everyone had a story. Everyone had been made to feel small, isolated, and powerless. By sharing their experiences, they realized their isolation was an illusion Karen had carefully constructed. United, they were not powerless. "So what do we do?" Eleanor Miller asked, her voice no longer trembling. We can't let her get away with this. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I hadn't called them here just to vent. I had called them here to recruit. We have two options, I said, leaning forward. Option one is the conventional route. We take this evidence to the district attorney's office. It could lead to a criminal investigation, but it will be slow and the outcome is uncertain. They might see it as a civil matter. I paused, letting that sink in. Option two is the one I favor. We use her own rules, her own system, against her. We launch a campaign to recall her and the entire complicit board. We do it publicly with this evidence as our weapon. We don't just defeat her, we dismantle her power structure and expose her for what she is to the entire community. Arthur Miller slammed his hand on the table, a broad grin spreading across his face. I like option two, he declared, a public reckoning. A chorus of agreement went around the table. The fear was gone, replaced by a palpable sense of purpose and empowerment. The Oak Ridge Estates Liberation Front had just been born. We spent the next hour planning. Arthur, with his union background, would help draft the recall petition and plan the signature gathering strategy. Dr. Chen, meticulous and detail-oriented, would help create a concise, factual summary of the financial evidence to distribute to residents. Mr. Rodriguez offered to discreetly talk to other families in the newer section of the development. Sarah, my ever-supportive wife, would manage communications, setting up a private email list to keep our small group coordinated. My role was to continue my primary assault and to set the final trap. The satellite dish, the issue that started it all, was still my key piece of leverage. Karen still didn't realize that her precious guard shack security system was entirely dependent on the ugly thing on my roof. It was time to make her formally aware of that fact, in a way she could not ignore. With my small alliance now firmly established, it was time to escalate the legal front. My personal fight over the dish needed to be transformed into an unassailable legal position that would serve as the linchpin for our broader campaign. For that, I needed professional help. I called my old friend and former JAG officer, Dave Riley. Dave and I had served together in Iraq, navigating the complex rules of engagement and the even more complex local power dynamics. After leaving the Army, he'd become a corporate lawyer specializing in contract disputes. He was sharp, aggressive, and had a deep-seated contempt for bullies. I met him for lunch at a scruffy diner halfway between our homes. Over greasy cheeseburgers and watery coffee, I laid out the entire saga. The dish, the guard shack, Karen's threats, the formation of our neighborhood alliance, and the bombshell discovery of the Vance Services fraud. I showed him the binder, now bulging with documents, emails, and photographs. Dave listened intently, his expression shifting from amusement to professional interest, and finally to a grim smile I knew all too well. It was the look he got when he smelled blood in the water. "Jackie boy," he said, leaning back in the vinyl booth and wiping his hands on a napkin. "You haven't just stumbled into an HOA dispute. You've walked into a racketeering case. This is beautiful." He flipped through the invoices from Vance Services. "This is classic self-dealing. Breach of fiduciary duty is the least of her worries. This smells like wire fraud, mail fraud. She's using an interstate communications facility, the phone and internet, to perpetuate a scheme to defraud. This has federal implications if you wanted to push it." "I don't want to push it that far, not yet," I said. "I want to use the system to beat her. A community recall, public humiliation. I want her stripped of her power by the very people she's been lording it over." "I like it," Dave grinned. "Poetic justice. So the satellite dish is the trigger. She's still threatening to have it removed?" "The fines are piling up." "According to the letter she's still sending," I confirmed. "She set a final removal date for 10 days from now, after which she claims the HOA will hire a contractor to remove it at my expense." "Perfect," Dave said, his eyes lighting up. "She's arrogant enough to walk right into the kill zone. We're not going to argue with her about the dish anymore. We're going to agree with her." I must have looked confused because he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We're going to send her a letter, not a letter of protest, but a letter of acknowledgement. It will be the most polite, helpful, customer service letter you've ever seen, and it will be her undoing. We spent the next hour outlining the letter. It was a work of legal art, a trap disguised as a compliance notice. Back at my home office, using Dave's draft as a template, I composed the letter. It was addressed to Karen and the entire board of directors. The subject line read, "Acknowledgement of service termination for GuardShack internet connectivity." The tone was cool, professional, and devastatingly precise. It began by acknowledging receipt of their final notice regarding the removal of my satellite equipment. It stated that, in the spirit of compliance, I would not physically resist the removal of the dish on the specified date. Then came the pivot. The letter went on to state, "Please be advised that this satellite equipment is the sole source of internet connectivity for the Oak Ridge Estates Guard Shack. Per the verbal agreement made on date with Board Representative George Miller and subsequently relied upon by the Board for Security Operations. The removal of this equipment will result in the immediate and permanent termination of this complimentary service." It then detailed in bullet points exactly what that termination of service would entail. Immediate loss of connectivity for all security cameras at the front gate. Immediate failure of the IP-based visitor logging system, rendering guards unable to digitally verify or record guest entry. Potential disruption to the automated gate system, which relied on the network for remote access and diagnostics. Termination of the dedicated VoIP phone line used by the guards for non-emergency communication. The letter then included a hold harmless clause that Dave had written, a beautiful piece of legalese stating that upon termination of the service, I, Jack Garrison, would be held entirely harmless for any and all security breaches, property damage, or other liabilities arising from the failure of the security systems that were dependent on the internet connection I had been providing. It concluded with the iciest sentence of all, "We have enjoyed providing this complimentary service to the community and trust that the board has a contingency plan in place to ensure the continuity of its security operations. Please feel free to contact me if you require any technical specifications of the now defunct system to assist in your transition to a new provider." I attached a final, meticulously detailed invoice for 1 month of complimentary Guard Shack internet service, with every line item showing a cost of $0 marked me paid in full. It was a receipt for the service they were about to throw away. I sent the letter via email to the entire board, and for good measure, I sent a physical copy via registered mail to Karen's home address and to the HOA's official address. There was no way she could claim she hadn't seen it. The trap was set. The beauty of it was that it used her own arrogance against her. To retreat now, she would have to admit to the entire board and eventually the community that her personal vendetta against my ugly dish was about to cripple the multi-$1,000 security system she had championed. She would have to admit that she had no idea how the system even worked. Her pride would never allow it. Dave was certain she would either ignore the letter or misinterpret it as a sign of my surrender. She would assume I was bluffing, that the complex systems at the gate couldn't possibly be running off one man's home internet. She would see the letter as a white flag, not the pin being pulled from a grenade. And in 10 days, when her contractor showed up to cut the cable, that grenade would go off right in her face. The wait was excruciating, but I filled the time by coordinating with my alliance. Arthur Miller had drafted the recall petition, and we had our talking points ready. We were just waiting for the right moment, the catalyst that would galvanize the entire community to our cause. We were waiting for Karen to light the fuse herself. The 10 days leading up to the final removal date were a strange sort of calm before the storm. There was no direct response from Karen or the board to my legal letter. George called once, his voice strained, to ask if I was really sure about this. I assured him I was simply complying with the board's directive and that I had made them fully aware of the consequences. He sighed and said, "She's not listening to anyone. She thinks you're bluffing." That was all I needed to hear. On the morning of the removal, I was ready. I had positioned a small, discreet security camera in my upstairs window, aimed directly at the side of the house where the dish was mounted. It was feeding a live, time-stamped recording directly to a secure cloud server. Sarah, bless her heart, was a nervous wreck pacing the kitchen with a coffee mug in her hands. "What if she doesn't do it?" she asked. "What if she finally came to her senses?" "Her kind of pride doesn't allow for common sense," I said, watching the empty street. "She's backed herself into a corner. The only way out in her mind is to double down and prove she's in charge. At 10:03 a.m., a white utility van with no company logo pulled up to the curb. A man in greasy overalls got out, looked at a work order on a clipboard, and then stared up at my roofline. He seemed uncertain, walking the property line and glancing back at his van. This wasn't a professional satellite installer. This was a generic handyman, likely the cheapest one Karen could find. He knocked on my door. I opened it, my demeanor calm and neutral. "Can I help you?" Yeah, he said, shifting his weight. "Got a work order here from the Oak Ridge HOA. Says I'm supposed to, remove a satellite dish?" "That would be the one on the west side of the house," I said, pointing. "Just be careful of the rose bushes underneath." His eyes widened slightly in surprise at my cooperativeness. "Oh, okay, you're okay with this?" "I'm not going to impede you from doing the job you were hired to do," I said carefully. "The HOA has ordered it removed. You're the one they sent. That's between you and them." He shrugged, relieved that he wasn't in for a fight, and went back to his van to get a ladder. As he set up, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Dave. "The contractor is here," I said. "It's happening." "Excellent," Dave replied. "The moment that cable is cut, send the community email we drafted. Don't wait. The timing is everything." The second call was to Arthur Miller. "Phase 2 is a go," I said. "He's on the ladder now." "We're ready." Arthur's voice crackled with excitement. "The petitions are printed. We'll start collecting signatures the minute we hear the boom." I went back to my office window and watched. The man climbed the ladder, carrying a pair of heavy-duty cable cutters. He fumbled for a moment, then positioned the cutters on the thick black coaxial cable that ran from the dish into my attic. There was a distinct snap that I heard even through the double-pane glass. The cable fell away, dangling uselessly against the siding. The man clipped the zip ties holding it in place, coiled it up, and then unbolted the dish from its mount. The ugly thing was officially disconnected. The time on my recording was 10:17 a.m. I gave the handyman a bottle of water as he packed up. He was sweating profusely. "Thanks," he mumbled. "Weird job. Usually people are yelling at me when I do this stuff." He handed me a carbon copy of the work order. It was signed by Karen Vance, the final piece of evidence. He drove away and the street was quiet again. For about 5 minutes. At 10:22 a.m., my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. I answered. "Hello? Mr. Garrison, this is Steve down at the guard shack." The guard's voice was filled with panic. "Something's wrong. Everything just died. The cameras are all black, my computer's offline, and the main gate is stuck half open. I can't get it to close or open all the way. There's a line of cars backing up out onto the main road." I injected a note of polite concern into my voice. "That sounds serious, Steve. Did you lose power?" "No, the lights are on. It's the network. Everything is down. I tried calling the management company, but they're useless. I remembered you set this all up. Do you have any idea what's going on?" This was the moment. The beautiful, perfect, inevitable moment of consequence. "Actually, Steve, I think I do," I said calmly. "The HOA president, Karen Vance, ordered the satellite dish on my house, which provides your internet, to be forcibly removed this morning. A contractor just took it down about 5 minutes ago." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. I could hear cars honking in the background. What? Are you kidding me? This whole system runs off your house?" "It did," I corrected him gently. As of 10:17 a.m., the service was permanently terminated at the HOA's directive. I sent them a letter last week explaining this would happen, but they decided to proceed anyway. "I'm sorry you're caught in the middle of it, Steve." "Caught in the middle?" he squeaked. "I've got a dozen angry residents yelling at me and a delivery truck blocking the entrance. What am I supposed to do?" "I would suggest," I said, my voice dropping to a helpful advisory tone, "that you call Mrs. Vance directly. It was her decision. This is her problem to solve." I gave him her personal cell number, which I had found on an old community newsletter. "Good luck, Steve." I hung up the phone and turned to my computer. Sarah was standing in the doorway, her hand over her mouth, a look of shocked delight on her face. I opened my email client, pulled up the draft Dave and I had prepared, and attached 3 files: a PDF of the legal letter we had sent, a copy of the work order signed by Karen, and a short 30-second video clip from my security camera showing the cable being cut. I addressed the email to the Oak Ridge Estates community distribution list, which I had painstakingly compiled. The subject line was simple and devastating: urgent explanation of front gate security failure. Then I hit send. The grenade had officially been dropped. The email landed in over 300 inboxes simultaneously. It was a digital bombshell, and the fallout was immediate and spectacular. My phone, which had been quiet moments before, began to vibrate incessantly with incoming texts and emails. The private email list for our little alliance lit up with messages of "it's sent" and "here we go." Sarah was monitoring the neighborhood's unofficial Facebook group, and her eyes were wide. "Oh my God, Jack," she said, half laughing, half horrified. "People are losing their minds." She read a few of the comments aloud. "What the hell is going on at the gate? I've been stuck for 20 minutes. My daughter's school bus can't get in. I just read the email from Mr. Garrison. Is this for real? Did Karen really do this?" The post containing my email, which someone had immediately screenshotted and shared, was exploding with comments and angry face reactions. The narrative was taking hold exactly as I'd planned. I wasn't the disgruntled homeowner. I was the helpful neighbor whose generosity had been thrown back in his face, with the entire community paying the price. Karen, the self-proclaimed guardian of community standards, was being exposed as a reckless fool who had single-handedly compromised the neighborhood's security over a personal grudge. Her carefully cultivated image of competence and authority was dissolving in real time. Around 11 a.m., I received a call from a number I didn't recognize, with a local area code. "Is this Jack Garrison?" a brisk, professional female voice asked. "Speaking." "My name is Susan Miller. I'm a reporter with the local news channel. We've been getting calls about a major traffic jam and some kind of security issue at the Oak Ridge Estates entrance. We also had a copy of an email you apparently sent to the residents forwarded to us. Would you be willing to speak with me on the record about what's happening?" The media. It was more than I had hoped for. "I'd be happy to clarify the situation," I said, keeping my tone measured and factual. I spent 15 minutes walking her through the timeline, from my free offer to help with the guard shack, to Karen's violation notices, to the legal letter I sent, and the final removal of the dish. I was careful not to sound emotional or vindictive. I was just a homeowner, a veteran, who had tried to do a good deed and was now explaining the unfortunate but predictable consequences of the HOA board's actions. I emailed her the same documents I had sent to the residents. "And you have this on video?" she asked, her interest clearly piqued. "I do," I confirmed. "And the HOA president, Karen Vance, she signed the work order for the removal herself?" "That's correct. I can send you a copy of that as well." "Thank you, Mr. Garrison. We'll be reaching out to Mrs. Vance for a comment." I knew that call would not go well for Karen. A news van was parked at the entrance to the community by noon, filming the chaotic scene, and his guards struggled to manually operate the broken gate. Meanwhile, Arthur Miller and his team of petition wielders had sprung into action. They weren't going door to door in secret anymore. They were set up at the still jammed entrance, a choke point every angry resident had to pass through. Arthur, with his booming voice and infectious energy, was in his element. "Tired of the incompetence?" he called out to drivers stuck in line. "Tired of one person's ego holding this entire community hostage? Sign the petition to recall Karen Vance and the entire board. Let's take back our neighborhood." People were practically grabbing the clipboards from their hands. The anger and frustration of the morning's chaos, combined with the stunning revelations in my email, had created the perfect storm. They weren't just signing a petition, they were joining a rebellion. Karen's response, when it finally came, was a masterwork of panicked self-destruction. Around 2 p.m., she sent a community-wide email of her own. It was a frantic, typo-riddled tirade that accused me of sabotaging the community's security system and engaging in a campaign of harassment and slander. She claimed my satellite dish was an illegal installation, a lie, and that my internet service was unreliable and a security risk. Another lie, considering she had relied on it for a month. She made no mention of the legal letter she had received or the fact that she had been explicitly warned. She portrayed herself as the victim, a dedicated volunteer under attack from a troublemaker who refused to follow the rules. It was a fatal error. By responding with anger and accusations instead of facts, she looked unhinged. My calm, evidence-based email made her frantic denial seem pathetic and dishonest. The comments on the Facebook page were brutal. Sabotage? He sent you a letter telling you exactly what would happen. If his internet was such a security risk, why were you using it for the front gate, Karen? This is embarrassing. You owe us all an apology and a resignation. George, the treasurer, sent me a one-line email. I am resigning from the board, effective immediately. He was the first rat to jump from the sinking ship. By late afternoon, the story was the lead item on the local news website, complete with a picture of the broken gate and a very unflattering photo of Karen they must have pulled from the HOA's website. The headline read, HOA dispute leaves gated community's security system sabotaged by its own president. They quoted my calm explanation and contrasted it with Karen's frantic, accusatory statement. They even included a short clip from my security camera video. Her public humiliation was complete. She had started a war over a small piece of metal on my roof, and in her arrogance, she had managed to lose it on every possible front. Legally, socially, and now publicly. The recall petition had over 150 signatures by dinner time, more than enough to force a special meeting. The final battle was set. It wouldn't be fought with lawyers or emails, but face-to-face in a public forum where she would have nowhere left to hide. The special meeting for the recall vote was scheduled for 2 weeks after the Gate incident, as it had been dubbed on the community Facebook page. The venue had to be moved from the small HOA clubhouse to the local middle school auditorium to accommodate the expected crowd. In those 2 weeks, Karen and her few remaining allies on the board were completely silent. They were hunkered down, no doubt plotting a defense, but their public authority had vanished overnight. The gate had been jury-rigged to stay open permanently, a constant, visible reminder of Karen's failure. Our alliance used the time to prepare for the final confrontation. This wasn't going to be an emotional shouting match. It was going to be a systematic, factual prosecution in the court of public opinion. Dr. Chen prepared a crisp PowerPoint presentation, breaking down the Vance Services financial fraud into simple, easy-to-understand charts. Arthur Miller prepared the opening and closing statements, drawing on his decades of experience in public speaking. Mr. Rodriguez organized a roster of residents who were willing to stand up and speak for a strict 2-minute limit, each sharing their personal story of the harassment. My role was to present the central case, the timeline of the satellite dish dispute, proving it was a case of personal animus, not legitimate governance. The night of the meeting, the auditorium was packed. I had never seen more than 20 people at an HOA meeting before. Tonight, there were over 400. The air was thick with anticipation and anger. It felt less like a community meeting and more like a revolutionary tribunal. Karen and the 2 remaining board members sat at a long table on the stage, looking small and isolated under the harsh fluorescent lights. Karen was wearing a severe black blazer, an attempt to project authority that only made her look like she was attending her own funeral. Her face was pale, and she refused to make eye contact with the crowd. The meeting was moderated by a neutral third-party attorney, a requirement for recall votes. After the procedural formalities, the floor was given to Arthur Miller to present the case for the recall. He walked to the podium, not with anger, but with a somber gravity. "Neighbors," he began, his voice resonating through the auditorium, "we are here tonight not because of a simple disagreement. We are here because of a fundamental breach of trust. We are here because the leadership we elected to serve this community has chosen instead to rule it, to bully it, and to profit from it." He then yielded the floor to me. I walked the audience through the satellite dish saga, my voice calm and steady. I put the legal letter I had sent to the board up on the projector screen. "This was not a surprise," I said, pointing to the key paragraphs. "This was a choice to place a personal grudge above the security and well-being of our entire community. A choice made by one person who was warned, in writing, of the exact consequences." Next came Dr. Chen. She presented the financial data with the cool precision of a surgeon. The slide showing the $40,000 plus paid to Vance Services, with Harold Vance's name next to the title owner, drew an audible gasp from the crowd. She showed pictures of the repairs that had supposedly been done, contrasted with the current state of disrepair in those same common areas. The evidence of fraud was undeniable. Then came the residents. One by one, they stepped up to the microphone. Eleanor Miller, her voice trembling but clear, spoke of the fines for her rose bushes. Mr. Rodriguez spoke of having to defend his son's right to play basketball. A young military wife spoke of being berated by Karen for parking her car on the street for 10 minutes, while she unloaded groceries in her sleeping baby. The stories, each a small injustice on its own, piled one on top of the other, forming a mountain of evidence of systemic abuse. It was powerful, emotional, and devastating. Finally, Karen was given the chance to respond. She walked to the podium, shuffling a stack of papers. She tried to stick to her script, accusing me of being a troublemaker and the financial allegations of being a misunderstanding. Vance Services provided valuable work, she began, but her voice was drowned out by a wave of scoffing and laughter. She tried to pivot, to attack my credibility. This man illegally installed. The crowd wasn't having it. He followed the rules, someone shouted from the back. You ignored him. She lost her composure. Her face turned a blotchy red. I have dedicated years of my life to this community, she shouted, her voice cracking. I have worked tirelessly to maintain our property values. And this is the thanks I get? You should be grateful. It was the worst possible thing as she could have said. The arrogance, the entitlement, the complete lack of remorse, it sealed her fate. The crowd erupted in a chorus of boos. The moderator had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order. The vote was a mere formality after that. It was done by paper ballot, collected and counted by the neutral attorney and a team of volunteers. While they counted, the room was filled with a low buzz of conversation. It felt like the spell had been broken. Neighbors were talking to each other, sharing their own stories, shaking their heads in disbelief at the sheer scope of the deceit. The attorney returned to the podium. The room fell silent. On the motion to recall President Karen Vance, he announced, his voice clinical. The votes are 412 in favor, 7 against. A wave of applause and cheers swept through the auditorium. It wasn't a cheer of vengeance, but of relief, of liberation. The other 2 board members were recalled by similar margins. In a single night, the entire corrupt regime had been swept away. After the vote, a motion was made from the floor to elect an interim board to manage affairs until a proper election could be held. Arthur Miller was nominated. Dr. Chen was nominated. To my complete surprise, someone nominated me. All 3 of us were elected by a unanimous voice vote. I stood on the stage looking out at the faces of my neighbors. 6 weeks ago, I had been a newcomer, facing down a bully over a piece of electronics. Now I was part of the new leadership, tasked with rebuilding the community's trust. As the meeting adjourned, people crowded around us, shaking our hands, thanking us. Eleanor Miller gave me a fierce hug. You gave us our neighborhood back, Jack, she said, tears in her eyes. I saw Karen slipping out a side door, her husband trailing behind her like a shadow. No one followed her. No one yelled at her. She was simply irrelevant. Her power, which had seemed so absolute, had been an illusion, built on fear and apathy. When confronted with organized facts and collective courage, it had crumbled into dust. Justice had been served. The weeks following the recall meeting were a whirlwind of activity, but it was the constructive, satisfying kind of work. As the interim board, our first priority was transparency and restoration. We hired an independent forensic accountant to conduct a full audit of the HOA's finances for the past 5 years. We sent a community-wide email explaining the process and promising to share the full report once it was complete. The message was clear. The era of secrets was over. Our second act was to address the immediate visible symbol of the old regime's failure, the front gate. I contacted my VSAT provider and ordered a new, slightly upgraded dish. I refused to let the HOA pay for it. This was still my personal equipment. However, we drafted a formal service contract between myself and the HOA. It stipulated a modest monthly fee, enough to cover the service on and a small amount for maintenance, and had a clear 30-day termination clause for either party. It was a proper business arrangement, documented and approved by the new board in an open meeting. The day I installed the new dish felt deeply symbolic. A few neighbors, including Arthur and the Millers, came out to watch. There were no threats this time, only smiles and offers of a cold drink. When I connected the final cable and saw the lights on the network switch in the guard shack blink back to life, a small cheer went up. The security cameras flickered on. The gate, which had been locked open, smoothly closed and then reopened with a quiet whir when Steve, the guard, tested the keypad. Order was restored, not by force, but by competence and cooperation. The forensic accountant's report came back a month later, and it was as damning as we expected. It confirmed over $50,000 in fraudulent or highly questionable payments to Vance Services. It also uncovered other instances of financial mismanagement, including paying the HOA's law firm a hefty retainer to handle petty violation disputes that should have been resolved by the board. We presented the report to the community at the next meeting. We also presented them with a choice. We had consulted with a new lawyer, not the old firm, who advised that we had grounds for both a civil lawsuit to claw back the funds and a criminal complaint with the district attorney. After a long and thoughtful discussion, the community reached a consensus. They didn't want a protracted, expensive legal battle. They wanted their money back, and they wanted the Vances gone. Our lawyer drafted a settlement demand letter to Karen and Harold Vance. It was simple: repay the full $50,000 documented by the audit within 60 days, and the HOA would agree not to pursue criminal charges. If they failed to comply, the full audit report would be handed over to the DA's office. Faced with the threat of a felony indictment, they folded. A cashier's check for the full amount arrived by mail 3 weeks later. 2 weeks after that, a for sale sign went up in front of Karen's house. The community watched in quiet satisfaction as their moving truck was loaded. There was no celebration, no gloating, just a collective sense of a chapter being closed. With the recovered funds, we made immediate improvements that benefited everyone. We repaired the playground, resurfaced the community tennis courts, and planted new trees in the common areas. We rewrote the vague and subjective clauses in the bylaws, replacing them with clear, objective rules. The Architectural Review Committee was expanded to 3 members, and no one could serve more than 2 consecutive years. Fines were now a last resort, preceded by friendly warnings and a mandatory in-person hearing with the full board. Power was decentralized. The atmosphere in Oak Ridge Estates transformed. The fear was gone, replaced by a sense of shared ownership. People started talking to each other more. The unofficial Facebook group, once a hotbed of complaints, was now filled with posts about block parties, tool sharing, and recommendations for local businesses. The final perfect grace note came on a warm Saturday in late spring. We held a community-wide barbecue at the clubhouse. The new board paid for the burgers and hot dogs out of the HOA budget, a use of funds no one objected to. I was manning the grill when Arthur Miller came up beside me, a beer in his hand. He gestured with his bottle toward the crowd of laughing, chatting neighbors. "Look at this," he said, a genuine smile on his face. "This is what a community is supposed to be, not a kingdom." I looked over and saw Eleanor Miller showing off a picture of her prize-winning roses to the Rodriguez family, whose son was now free to play basketball without fear. I saw Dr. Chen discussing gardening tips with a new homeowner. It was a scene of simple, profound peace. My satellite dish, the ugly thing that had started it all, was still on the side of my house, quietly doing its job. No one saw it as a blight anymore. If anything, it had become an unlikely symbol of our little revolution. It was a reminder that sometimes standing your ground over a small injustice can expose a much larger one. It was a testament to the fact that bullies only have the power you give them, and that a community, united by facts and a shared sense of decency, is a force that no petty tyrant can withstand. I flipped a burger on the grill, the sizzle a satisfying sound in the warm afternoon air. I had come to Oak Ridge looking for peace, and I'd had to go to war to find it. But looking at the faces of my neighbors, at the community we had reclaimed together, I knew that every battle had been worth it. Justice had been done, and peace, real peace, had finally been restored.